Hello, everyone. Welcome to the recording for the Beyond Manifest Destiny intro and part one lecture notes. So let's get started. Okay. So before we get into the lecture notes for this activity, I just want you to pause the recording for a minute and write at the top of your note sheet, which you should be following along with. Your note sheet looks like this. It says Beyond Manifest Destiny, Seizing the Global Empire note sheet. And it's in the same folder where you found this lecture. A brainstorm at the beginning. I want you to think back to what we've already learned this year and just describe how do economics and the ideology of white supremacy, how do those two pressures work to encourage territorial expansion of the United States? Think about things we've already learned this year. Think about the title of this lecture, hint, hint, and just try to describe in writing how those two things work together to encourage that thing. Economics and white supremacy work to encourage territorial expansion. So pause the recording and write that. And then when you unpause, we'll be right here, ready to go. Okay. So we're going to talk today about continued territorial expansion and emerging imperialism of the United States. I should say emerging foreign imperialism. I want to start here. I'm going to start in the Hawaiian Islands in 1891. In 1891, the Hawaiian Islands were ruled by that person right there that you see, Queen Liliuokalani. And at the time she was ruling the Hawaiian Islands, the economy of the Hawaiian Islands was dominated by sugar plantations. Sugar plantations were the main economic engine for Hawaii. And those sugar plantations were white American owned. And sorry, not just sugar, coffee, pineapple, all these things grown on plantations, plantation agriculture. And Hawaii, beyond having these really profitable plantation agricultures, had favorable situation characteristics. That's a human geography word. Situation, meaning the location of this place relative to other places and its relationship to the places around it. So why might wealthy white Americans, beyond the plantation agriculture, why might wealthy white Americans have seen Hawaii as a valuable place? East Asia. If you are engaged in or trying to engage in increased economic trade with East Asia, where some of the biggest populations and therefore biggest markets are, it's very favorable to have a naval base, an economic hub halfway to East Asia. And it was called at this time the Crossroads of the Pacific. So at this time in the early 1890s, the Queen rewrites the Constitution of the Hawaiian people to give more control to Native Hawaiians. Less control from the monarch, more control to the people, to Native Hawaiians. Now, think about it if you are a white American plantation owner who is exploiting the land and the people for their labor, and you're seeing that A, you're outnumbered by natives, and B, now the natives are going to have more political control. Well, as you can imagine, the plantation owners were not at all happy about that change by the Queen to rewrite the Constitution and give more control to Native Hawaiians. So the plantation owners, along with the help from US Marines, organized a coup in 1893 and removed the Queen from power, and then attempted to set up a new government and under the under the heading of that new government, they signed a treaty to allow Hawaii to be annexed by the United States. Annexed meaning annexation is to bring a territory in as a state, to claim a territory officially. So all that goes down. But in 1892, the United States had just elected a brand new president, Grover Cleveland, and he'd taken office in 1893. Here was Grover Cleveland's response to the situation, the developing situation in Hawaii. And back on your note sheet, you'll see the whole text of this response printed. And then I have a question for you to respond to, but I'll read the response. It has been the boast of our government that it seeks to do justice in all things without regard to the strength or weakness of those with whom it deals. A substantial wrong has thus been done, which a due regard for our national character, as well as the rights of the injured people, the native Hawaiians, requires we should endeavor to repair. If a feeble but friendly state is in danger of being robbed by its independence and its sovereignty by a misuse of the name and power of the United States cannot fail to vindicate its honor and its sense of justice by an earnest effort to make all possible reparations. A lot of big words in there. So pause the video and take a minute to write. What do you think Grover Cleveland's view is on the annexation of Hawaii, the attempted annexation of Hawaii? What does he think? Pause and write. So as you can, hopefully you were able to tell by the language in there, Grover Cleveland told the plantation owners, what have you done? Return the queen to the throne. We are absolutely not annexing Hawaii. This is a dishonor to the American name and an injustice to the Hawaiian people. And we can't just use our strength to exploit weak countries. It goes against our character and it goes against our honor. This is what Cleveland is saying in this response. The plantation owners refuse, and so they proclaim Hawaii to be an independent republic. If the United States won't help us, forget it. We're going to set up our own government. So I wanted to start with this specific example because it's one of America's early endeavors outside of the continent at imperialism, which we're going to talk about. But 6 years after this, by the end of 1898, by the start of 1899, the United States will have annexed not only Hawaii, but also Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So in this activity, in this unit, we're going to sort of unpack how we got from A to B and analyze it a little bit. One of the things central things that we're going to be looking at is something called the Spanish-American War, which is sometimes referred to in American history textbooks as the quote, splendid little war. This is a very lesser known war in terms of American history. It's not one that's dedicated, that gets a lot of textbook space dedicated to it. It's not one that lives in our public consciousness very much. If you ask the average American on the street to list the wars the United States has fought in, I would venture to guess that this one would probably be excluded from most people's responses. But we're going to study it because it gives us an interesting insight for a couple of reasons. One, it's our job to study foreign policy and war as future voters and participants in our political community. The choices that led us into the Spanish-American War and the choices that followed it set a pretty clear precedent for United States foreign policy in the 20th century. And so to understand where we are, we have to understand where we've been, and we have to understand where we began. Okay, and so this is really a helpful point to focus on when we think about what will help us understand our foreign policy of the last 150 years. Once the frontier was closed, as we'll talk about later. But also because it's our job to have opinions, not just on the things our government does for us, but the things that the government does in our name. We're supposed to have input on the government's foreign policy. The power of declaring war belongs to Congress and Congress alone as the people's representatives. And so there's an old expression that there's only two things that ever stop the government from doing anything: money and politics. Well, when the government attempts to do something domestically, domestic policy that is unpopular, there can be sometimes a big political pushback or backlash. And that is one way we inform the government of our displeasure or our pleasure about whatever policies they're pursuing. And I'll give you a current example of the voting rights suppressions that have been passed in Georgia, and that there's copycat bills in virtually every state legislature. And you're seeing a lot of political backlash. You're seeing people protesting. You're seeing celebrities and major corporations being outspoken. You're seeing the American public push back and say, this policy is not acceptable to us, and here's why. Okay, so that is a natural check in our democratic process that attempts to tell our government and force our government not to do something that we don't want done. So think about foreign policy. When our government takes actions against a foreign country or against the people of a foreign country, where's the political pressure? The people who feel the impacts are people who live in foreign countries. They don't have a political voice in the United States. They don't have a way to push back. So when we think about foreign policy, it's up to us to maintain the same type of political pressure we put on our government about domestic matters when we see them engaged in foreign policy that we don't like. So it is very much our duty as citizens, as members of this political community, to be informed, to have an opinion on our foreign policy. It matters. The things our government does in our name affect people all over the world. So that's one of the big reasons why we study foreign policy and why we're going to study this. And part of that equation is we have to ask ourselves, what is the tension here between our values and our interests? And we talked about values and interests earlier on this year. Our values are our ideals, those intangible qualities that we say we're about and that we want to live up to, namely freedom, democracy, equality, opportunity. Those are our four values, core values coming from the Declaration of Independence, and that have been touted and talked about ever since. And they're pretty good values, but we don't always live up to them. In fact, we need to continue to push to live up to them. And on the other hand, we have our interests, the specific, concrete, everyday things that we need to keep living and functioning and growing. We need partners to trade with. We need people to sell our products to so that our economy can prosper and people can have jobs and have money. We need energy. Our lives require energy. And so in order to power our energy grid, we need energy sources. So those are examples of our interests. And what we need to think about with our foreign policy, domestic policy as well, but foreign policy in particular, does this action uphold our values? Does it promote our interests? What happens when those two things are in conflict? What happens when an action would promote our interests but violate our values? What happens when an action would uphold our values but not sufficiently provide for our interests? Okay, that's the balancing act of balancing who we want to be with what we need. So we're going to go on a brief tour of what we've done so far, and then we're going to talk about this specific time period of the late 1800s. George Washington, very famously in his farewell address after his second term as president, gave a very historic and famous speech. And in part of his speech where he talked about foreign policy, he was very adamant about steering clear of permanent ties or obligations with foreign nations. And for the next 75 years, presidents and presidential administrations focused pretty tightly on the North American continent, and about domestic affairs. It's not to say that foreign policy didn't exist. There were lots of foreign policy issues and challenges, but in terms of the focus of our national discussion and our national government, we were very much focused domestically, whether it was on territorial expansion, further colonization of native lands, the Civil War, slavery, all these other issues. We were very much focused inward on the North American continent. And in the 1800s, another part of the bigger context of what we're talking about are some things you've already learned about before. Remember back to world history freshman year and you learned about the scramble for Africa. Remember back to Human Geo last year where you learned about the world systems theory. And the engine of imperialism, especially for European economic imperialism that we see in the 1800s, there were two main strategies that countries use to control wealth and power. Number one, use your country's companies to purchase or steal and control the natural resources of foreign states. Funnel those cheap or free resources back into your own industrial economy. So if you're Britain, colonize India, make cotton plantations. Funnel that cotton back into your own textile manufacturing sector. Number two, use military force to make sure your country dominates the import-export market of a foreign country. Remember back to when we talked about the American colonial period, where the government of Great Britain considered the colonies to be closed markets, right? They were closed markets. They could only trade with and to England. Okay, so those were the two big plays in the playbook for European economic imperialism. Use countries that are based in your companies based in your country to control access to natural resources abroad, and therefore secure those natural resources for manufacturing in your own economy. And then use military force. Sorry, the second, use military force to make sure your country dominates import-export markets. And Europeans did this in Africa, in Latin America, in South America, in Asia. And then we also talked about our own domestic imperialism in the form of manifest destiny, about how America didn't need to look outside of our own continent for imperial expansion. We moved west for that. And we talked about the economic motivations of that, expanding the land that could be used to plant cotton, and thus expanding plantation agriculture and expanding chattel slavery, opening new markets in the West and building railroads to access those markets. We talked about how that was driven by ideology, how there were numerous ideologies that developed to support and encourage those actions. Manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, white supremacy, and are using those three things to further the definition of Americanness. So hopefully that's what you wrote about a little bit at the top of your sheet here. So if you look at your sheet, you're following along, discuss the two main strategies. We're going to get into some data down here. And we've already talked a lot, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through it. We've talked a lot about industrialization and immigration in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and how that was changing our society drastically and permanently. How our population was growing rapidly. And again, think back to demographic transition, which we mentioned as we talked about industrialization. And the immigration rates, not the raw numbers. Our raw numbers are highest they've ever been right now. But the rates, immigration as a percentage of the total population, the rates were astronomically higher in the late 1800s, early 1900s. By the mid 1890s, more than 45% were of the citizens of this country were immigrants or children of immigrants. And that shifted our demographics. And the immigrants were coming from different places. They were no longer coming predominantly from what would be classically defined in race theory as white Northern and Western Europe. They were coming from now Southern and Eastern Europe, groups that were historically not granted white status. And they were settling in cities and ethnic enclaves in the Northeast. Here on this data, you can see a little bit of the change. It's hard to read, but it says Ireland, Germany, Britain, Scotland, Russia, Austria, Hungary, Italy. The immigration between 1850 and 1900 in 10-year blocks. And so you can see what percentage of total immigrants were coming from where. And in the early to mid 1800s, talking about the lion's share coming from Ireland, Germany, and Britain. And then that starts to shift. We talked about urbanization and how that transformed the United States during industrialization, how just after the country was formed, less than 5% of people live in cities. And by 1900, more than a third of people lived in cities. And that brought with it all kinds of new problems, problems that progressive leaders that we just studied attempted to remedy. Bad transportation, sanitation, crime, poor housing, political corruption, all these issues. And the decline of farming, where manufacturing had overtaken farming as the primary economic, I shouldn't say primary, that's confusing, as the most important economic activity by the turn of the century. And you did some reading in the Takaki book, A Different Mirror, about the experience of immigrants during the industrial period, different immigration groups. And what I wanted to point out, I'm kind of refreshing you on all these things because I want to bring them back to the top of your mind before we get into some new stuff specific to this unit. And one of those things that I want to mention is what you saw, hopefully in your reading in the A Different Mirror book, as the duality, this weird duality that we had on industrial era immigration, where on the one hand, part of what contributed to our rapid industrialization and made the US such an economic powerhouse was the massive influx of cheap labor provided by immigrant groups. People who immigrated here were willing to to work hard to make it or to prove their Americanness, and to take factory jobs, to work long hours, to start at the bottom and try to work up. And that labor provided the engine for industrialization. This country does not industrialize in the way it does and become the economic powerhouse it became without a massive labor force. So on the one hand, the immigrants were essential to American progress. But on the other hand, you had social and cultural backlashes. You had the combination of the shifting sources of immigration and rapid industrialization, making the white Americans who had earlier colonized this land challenging their white supremacy and challenging the homogeneity of American society. And that brought fear. And that fear was exacerbated and exploited by the power structure during industrialization, as we saw with, the gospel of wealth and all these other narratives that talked about why the power structure should remain hierarchical and why we shouldn't help the poor. And narratives that saw new immigrants as not as hardworking, not as intelligent, incapable of true Americanness, and all this fear around an unwanted change in America's identity. Sound familiar? So again, refreshing from what we talked about with industrialization, trade catapults us to being an economic global power. Um, and we're trading the products of our rapid industrialization. Um, in the 1890s, for the first time in our country's history, the value of our annual exports exceeds $1 billion. And that is significantly higher than the value of our imports, which creates what's called a trade surplus. So if you're exporting more goods than you're importing, that means you're selling more things than you're buying, which means that more money on aggregate is coming into your economy. And very, very beginner, simplistic economics 101, trade surpluses are good. You want to be exporting more things than you're importing because that brings more money into your economy, which is more room for growth and investment. And that means that your industries are doing well. And some of our main exports, cotton, grain, beef, tobacco, dairy, are all now joined by manufactured goods. Whereas when we started our process of industrializing, we were significantly behind countries like Britain and Germany in terms of exporting manufactured goods. Now, by 1900, we're on top. And 1/3 of all of our exports by 1900 are manufactured goods. And again, think back to your economic geo stuff from human geography last year. Manufactured goods bring a higher price return than primary resources. Just exporting cotton or beef does not bring as much return as exporting manufactured goods whose value grows over time. And the result of this is that it lifted up big business and it put tension on small farmers. And part of the international response to growing American dominance in global trade markets was European tariffs. We talked about tariffs a little bit already this year, but just to refresh your memory, a tariff is a tax on anything imported. And the reason why a country would pass a tariff is to encourage people to buy things made by companies within that country instead of buying foreign made goods. So European countries started guarding against American trade dominance with tariffs. And so that made US goods more expensive in European markets and made them perform not as well. And so US businesses start at the turn of the century here to be looking elsewhere for markets, looking in Latin America and looking in Asia, specifically in China, where the population is massive and growing. Early on in 1893, we see a big depression where two major railroads go bankrupt. This leads to a sort of domino effect where over 500 banks and 16,000 businesses end up going bankrupt in one calendar year. And some greater ripple effects of that, stockpiles of unsold manufactured goods. There's nobody who can, all these people are laid off, all these businesses have gone bankrupt. People can't afford to buy and purchase things at the same rate they used to. So the demand for goods drops, and that causes the price to crater and stockpiles of unsold goods to just sit there unsold. Millions of people lose their jobs. The economic recovery from this depression of 1893, it starts to turn around in 1896, but the economy won't fully recover until 1901 to its pre-depression levels. And part of sort of the social consciousness aspects of this is that workers fear their vulnerability. And much like you read about in the Socialist Challenge chapter in Zinn, and like we've seen elsewhere this year, this is another big catalyzing event that leads to a resurgence in collective action, an attempt to unionize and have collective action and protection for workers. As a result of this depression, 500,000 workers go on strike, and another 600,000 lose their jobs due to strike-related retaliations by businesses. So all of this stuff combined, I'm trying to paint the picture of the context, the background for you. All of this stuff combined, the attempts by the working class to unite, the depression, shifting economic output of the United States, the shifting demographics, the search for new markets outside of Europe. All of this leads to an increased use of identity politics and white supremacy to divide the lower classes, to prevent them from uniting. And coinciding with all this is the idea that by the 1890s, the Census Bureau has declared that the frontier is closed, that we've done it, so to speak. We've made it coast to coast, manifest destiny. There's no more frontier. We've gone from Atlantic to Pacific on this continent. And that effort supported by the ideas of manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, white supremacy, and a particular interpretation of Christianity, fueled that colonization of indigenous lands and acts of genocide against indigenous peoples. And part of that is this idea of the frontier, and that as part of all these ideas, the idea of the frontier became this sort of mythologized thing to aspire to, that out there in the West, there's these vast open lands, rich with resources, ready to be tamed by only the most adventurous Americans. And we talked about this narrative a little bit when we talked about relief valves with the Industrial Revolution, but this is part of the way in which the frontier, in which the West was painted. We see this legacy in American literature and even enduring in American movies and media well into the 20th and 21st centuries, where think about the dominance of the Western as a genre. And these ideas of adventurism, environmental dominance, and a particular form of masculinity that defines, dominance over the environment and overcoming adversity through adventure as this really essential part of what it means to be a white American male. And part of the push behind this, look, ideas don't just happen for no reason. Ideas are cultivated because there's a benefit to them. And the economic benefit to the ideas of frontierism and manifest destiny is that it was good for the economy. Economic growth in the 1800s was fueled by land. Land has always been the number one driver of economic growth, whether it's land for crops, land for real estate, land for railroads to increase transportation between markets, land for extraction of natural resources. Okay, land has always been, throughout the 1800s, the number one, what's the economic heart of those myths around the frontier and the opportunity the frontier holds. For the downtrodden factory worker in the East, the promise of opportunity, of the ability to be your own boss, to make your own way in the world, to have your own piece of land, to have something you own, to move from being a laborer to an owner. That was a huge part of that draw for westward colonization. And again, now at the time period we're talking about in the late 1890s, that's all gone. In 1890, the Census Bureau declares that the frontier is closed, that we have successfully colonized from coast to coast. And so when you have an idea that is that powerful in culture, as the frontier was, and now it's suddenly gone, it's going to be replaced with something. So where will the new frontier be? Where will the new next adventure be, that where people can prove their Americanness and find and seize opportunity, economic opportunity? Where will we exploit new land, extract new resources, subjugate new peoples for continued economic growth? So also remember, from the perspective of the owning class, from the political and economic owning classes, The West was a relief valve for diffusing economic class tensions, for preventing lower classes from uniting to try to seize more power. What happens when that relief valve is gone? Where's the next relief valve going to be? So, in thinking about what's next, economic and political decision makers believed that once the frontier was closed, overseas expansion was the obvious next step. And especially east from the Pacific, east into Asia, into Chinese markets. Where there's a large population, there's a large market. And so the people in power economically and politically leveraged the white fears of America's rapid change and the belief in that American use of power was always righteous, which we're going to get to in a minute, to support this strategy to expand, expand overseas. And moves by Japan and European countries to try to cut exclusive trade deals with China also created this sense of urgency among US policymakers to say, look, other countries are going to do this if we don't. Other countries are going to try and carve up China and have exclusive trade deals with them if we don't get in there. So we got to get in there. So some other overseas ambitions of policymakers and military leaders: a canal in Central America to bridge travel between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, so one did not have to travel all the way around the tip of South America. This idea of a canal running through Central America was economically invaluable. The amount of dollars attached to the value of that idea was astronomical. And other military and economic policymakers wanted us to get more involved in the Caribbean, in the plantation agriculture that was going on in the Caribbean and in Hawaii, so that we could support trade both eastward and westward. And all of these people could broadly be categorized as expansionists, people that wanted the United States to continue expanding past the continental bounds, beyond ocean to ocean. And there was a range of different views, from we should get a few strategic overseas ports to we need to build a vast empire. Okay, so those would sort of be the two ends of the spectrum of expansionists. And because there was economic benefit to be had, and because, as you're going to see, it took some convincing of the American people. American people didn't always just want to support imperialist expansion. Part of the ideology that grows to support that is race science in the heaviest possible air quotes. So we already talked about social Darwinism and how social Darwinism applied the simplistic interpretation of Darwin's survival of the fittest notion to chart the economic and social progress of different groups of people, and to say that different races, different cultures were different types of people, and certain cultures were more fit to survive and other cultures were weaker and should naturally face extinction. And the cultures of Western Europe and America, to nobody's surprise at all, were viewed as superior and represented the ideal evolution of humanity. And a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about with this justification through race science is stuff that you saw in the video Race, the Power of an Illusion, episode 2, where it talked about race from going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, all the way through the World's Fair in the early 1900s. So we're going to sort of be reviewing some of that information and seeing how it fits in this context. But the idea was that other groups that were not the cultures of Western Europe or America or white America They needed to evolve into us. They needed to assimilate and adopt our religion, our economy, our culture, our ways of knowing, our ways of speaking. Um, Otherwise, they would naturally go extinct, and that was fine because they weren't the fittest. And this ideology becomes the base of the justification for imperialism. And I have a quote here from U.S. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a senator from Massachusetts in the 1890s. The great nations are rapidly absorbing all the waste places of earth. It is a movement which makes for civilization and the advancement of race. As one of the great nations of the world, the United States must not fall out of line of march. Think about the words he uses to describe economically and politically subjugated countries, the waste places of the earth. And so you see this sort of, at the turn of the century time here, this emergence of a scientific version of racism. Like we saw, we've had racism for a long time. We've had racism since before we were a country. We looked at this with the color line activities, the 1619 Project. The idea of dividing people by race was created on this continent, and it was created for a multitude of reasons that you looked at. But as we grow in technology through the Industrial Revolution, our ways of talking about race and attempting to justify racism, it shifts. And it shifts to try to deputize science, to try to use science as a way to say, see, these ideas we had about race, they're confirmed. And in fact, even taking them further and more damaging. And so this idea of scientific racism assigned differences to people according to racial and ethnic groups. That different racial and ethnic groups had different mental abilities, physical abilities, personality traits, characteristics. There were certain traits or characteristics that belonged to certain groups. And that created a hierarchy of humanities races. And because this hierarchy and this race science was created by white male scientists from Northern Europe, guess who was at the top of the hierarchy? The people of Northern Europe. And then there was a whole hierarchy of, then it's these people, then it's these people, then it's these people, and African people were placed at the bottom of this hierarchy. And the main sort of science that was being used to make this argument was skull shape and brain size, which just there are all kinds of problems with the process here. And it talked about this in Race, the Power of an Illusion episode 2. But they used samples of skull shape and brain size to say, oh, well, people from this continent have bigger skulls and bigger brain size, so therefore they're capable of a higher intelligence. One of the things from Race, the Power of an Illusion episode 2 that I think bears repeating here is when they did this experiment with skull shape and brain size in America, they found that Americans have the biggest capacity for intelligence, white Americans, I should say. When they did this in England, they found that the British have the highest capacity for intelligence. When they did this in France, they found that white French people have the highest capacity. And so depending on where you were, the conclusions were changed to suit the political and economic hierarchy. And it should be said that this method of skull shape and brain size, this is also the same rationale that was used to declare that men were more intelligent than women. That by science, that men had bigger brains and were therefore more intelligent than women, and that's why women shouldn't be allowed to vote. And so all of this oppression, we talked about intersectionality, all of this oppression is intersectional with under this faulty scientific racism and sexism. And because of all this, the actual advancements that Black, Indigenous, people of color were making in society, in science, in politics, in economics, you just studied a bunch of different progressive activists that made all kinds of amazing achievements and worked hard and had inspiring stories. All of these achievements by these people were rendered as invisible. They weren't talked about, they weren't reported about, or they were just dismissed as exceptions to the rule. And this ideology of scientific racism gave a scientific legitimacy to the old ideas that we'd used to oppress all non-white peoples since the 1600s. And I have a quote here that is from Encyclopedia Britannica. By nearly unanimous consent of anthropologists, this type, the pure Negro of Central Africa, occupies the lowest position on the evolutionary scale. The attempt to suddenly transform the Negro mind by foreign culture must be as futile as the attempt would be to suddenly transform his physical type. That's the Encyclopedia Britannica. So again, I'm going to reiterate here what I've tried to reiterate all year. White supremacy was not a fringe idea. It wasn't something that extremists believe. White supremacy is the central intellectual tentpole of American life, and it has been for 400 years. It's the central idea of our intellectual life. The notion that there are different types of people, and therefore there should be a hierarchy where those different types of people belong. And if we think about the consequences of these ideas, this, what I've put in the title as the suspiciously convenient political consequences of social Darwinism and scientific racism, is that Western European nations, including America, well, because these are the countries that are populated with these superiorly evolved beings, these people that are at the top of the evolutionary scale, of course they should rule the world. They're the best beings in the world. The best beings should be the rulers. And universities, major publications, newspapers, public figures, political leaders, all legitimized and circulated these ideas. Again, they were not fringe. This was the central ideology of white American life. And the vast majority of white Americans accepted these principles and accepted scientific racism as fact. And then it was also connected to religion. And we saw that during industrialization with the gospel of wealth, with this perversion of Christian ideals. And we see it again here with scientific racism, that many Protestant churches preached that it was America's role to lift up the downtrodden people of other nations. How would they do that? Missionaries. And that God had specially blessed white Americans, and that it was white Americans' duty, because of that blessing, to, quote, civilize the world. In other words, make the entire world live like us. And thus, imperialism was not just scientifically warranted, it was holy. It was part of God's righteous plan for humanity. And I want you to think back to what we read about with the Calvinist origin story, about the tenets of this particular version of Christianity that viewed that you're either part of the elect few chosen by God or you're not. And nothing you can do can change whether you are part of the elect or not. And that material wealth is a sign of being part of the elect. All of this stuff is the continuation of those ideas. And since we're talking about this time period in the 1890s, let's talk about a legal manifestation of these ideas. I'm sure that many people have probably at least heard of the case Plessy versus Ferguson, which is the Supreme Court case that allowed the establishment of the idea of separate but equal, of legal segregation. We know the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed in the United States after the Civil War during Reconstruction to establish what's called de jure legal equality, meaning in law legal equality. 14th Amendment defines who a citizen is and says that all citizens have the same rights of due process under the law. But de facto, meaning in practice, we know this was not the reality. There was a Louisiana law that required separate but equal, that's a quote from the law, accommodations for railroad passengers, meaning if you traveled on a railroad, there's a car for white people and a car for non-white people. And a man named Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 African American, defied the law on purpose as an act of protest and insisted he had the right to use the white car. And he was arrested and convicted by the Louisiana courts of violating this separate but equal law. He appealed to the Supreme Court, where his case was decided by a 7-1 majority. The court upheld the Louisiana court's ruling, saying that separate but equal was okay. And they argued in their majority opinion, the 7 justices to the 1 dissenting, they argued that the 14th Amendment, though it gives legal equality, it was not intended to promote integration of the races. That for these 7 justices, they said legal equality and public integration were not the same thing. And even though the 14th Amendment says we have to give legal equality, that doesn't mean that we have to give integration. And they also rejected the idea in their comments that the Constitution should be a tool that we use to overcome racist attitudes. So again, think about all of this ideological and economic history in the context that we're going to look at now of expanding beyond our continental borders. And so despite, widespread acceptance of racist ideology that we just talked about, there were a lot of Americans who were still unconvinced of the need for imperialism, for the United States to colonize and take control of foreign countries and foreign places. And even among some expansionists, they thought that we should just be an example, or at most an advisor for the quote uncivilized parts of the world. So there's where you see the racist ideology. So even though people were accepting the notion that Americans were naturally better than everyone else, and that there were other parts of the uncivilized world that we were better than, they were still not accepting the political proposition of imperialism, of going and taking over those countries. William McKinley, who becomes president in 1896, or he's elected in 1896, sworn in 1897, he favored economic expansion, but he didn't, when he entered office, support annexation or colonization. So of that group of expansionists, he would have been on the side of let's secure some ports, let's make sure we can expand economically into new markets, but we don't need to politically take over those countries. We don't need to colonize them or annex them. And in the face of McKinley's election, imperialists, people who are at the other end of that spectrum, who wanted annexation, who wanted direct control, worked to go against this resistance from the American people and from McKinley to imperialism. I have a quote here from McKinley's inaugural. "Our diplomacy should seek nothing more and accept nothing less than is due us. We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation to territorial aggression. War should never be entered upon until every agency of peace has failed. Peace is preferable to war in almost every contingency. Arbitration is the true method of settlement of international as well as local or individual differences." So he's pretty clearly in this quote, diplomacy is better than conquest. Peace is better than war. Keep track of how that changes over time. So now I want to give you some context on a couple of specific places leading up to the Spanish-American War. In 1878, the U.S. Made a treaty with the Samoan Islands. Here's U.S. right here. Here's Hawaii. Here are the Samoan Islands, sort of in that region of Fiji, Tonga, Tahiti, all of these Polynesian chain of islands, New Zealand, Australia, East Asia over here. So in 1878, the US makes a treaty with Samoa in which we promise naval assistance. We promise them military assistance if any foreign governments interfere with Samoa in exchange for free use of their harbors by our Navy. And I put think protection money, because that's a good analogy that I can give you if you've ever seen any movies or TV shows about, mobsters, where it's the idea of protection money. You pay us to protect you, and we'll make sure nobody else messes with you, but you have to pay us. But who's protecting you from us? Germany and Britain each are trying to access or annex parts of the Samoan Islands as a harbor en route to, British colony of Australia, New Zealand, and East Asia. And there's some conflict, and the settlement of the conflict is that in 1898, the islands are partitioned, and parts of Samoa become American territory. Certain islands of Samoa become American territory. And then we have Venezuela in the 1890s. The British are attempting to exert influence in Venezuela because there's rich deposits of gold and other things in Venezuela the British wanted access to. And in 1895, the US Secretary of State at the time sort of raises concerns to the military and political establishment that we don't want European countries colonizing Latin America like they did with Africa. Part of that was something called the Monroe Doctrine, which goes all the way back to James Monroe, one of our early presidents, who sort of established this precedent with European nations that European nations would not seek any new colonization efforts in the Western Hemisphere. You stay out of our backyard, and we won't seek any new colonization efforts in Asia or Africa. And so this attempt by the British to sort of seize control in Venezuela was seen as a threat to that sort of balance of power of Europe versus America, who has access to colonize what parts of the world. And it was resolved via a treaty between the US and Great Britain that established a border commission to settle any disputes in Venezuela. And it's worth noting that the border commission included no Venezuelans. And so then we get to the late 1890s, back to where we started with Hawaii. By 1897, a quarter of Hawaii's population were Japanese immigrants who were employed as laborers on American-owned plantations. And some of you read about this in those of you who read about the chapter of Japanese immigration in A Different Mirror. And the American plantation owners see this as a threat, that a growing percentage of the population as Japanese immigrants. And so the American government in Hawaii, or the white American government run by the plantation owners in Hawaii, attempts to restrict Japanese immigration, as the mainland United States had already done through the Asian Exclusion Acts. And just Japan's response was they sent a message and a naval cruiser to the white American government in Hawaii saying, no way, don't pass this bill. Do not attempt to restrict Japanese immigration. And now, by this point in time, a couple of years after his election, McKinley, who's now been growing increasingly imperialist, moved away from that end of the spectrum where it's let's just focus on economics, and he's been pushed further towards the imperialist end of the spectrum. Look for that trend in future American presidents, where they say one thing in their inaugural address and then policy pushes them the other way. McKinley points out that the Japanese immigrants in Hawaii are going to demand rights sooner or later. The population is they're 1/4 of the population. They're being exploited for their labor. They're being treated as less than those who are at the top. And what happens when they demand rights? What happens, more importantly, if they try to shut us out of our very important naval base, Pearl Harbor? McKinley then puts forward a resolution to annex Hawaii. And in support of the resolution, he says, we need Hawaii as much and a good deal more than we did California. It is manifest destiny. So throughout the 1890s, America will intervene in Chile, Brazil, Nicaragua, and many, many more places in Latin America. US decision makers throughout the 1890s are increasingly willing and eager to meddle, interfere in the politics and affairs of Latin American countries to make sure that economic conditions are ideal for American companies. And as we talked about, this intervention is fueled by a racist and holy sense of superiority. And these interventions rarely, if ever, consider the indigenous populations, their wishes, their interests, their welfare. And this trend that we were on would eventually lead us to war with Spain in Cuba. So that's the end of our notes for this section. And hopefully you've written down some of your takeaways from each section as we went through it. And now at the end, I want you to think about all you've heard and write down 2 aha moments or two things that stood out to you. And then 1 question you have going forward. So the point of that lecture was to give you all this background context on the political, economic, social context of America, what we already had done in terms of foreign intervention, leading up to the Spanish-American War. And now your next task is going to be to read about the Spanish-American War. So thank you all for watching, and email me if you have any questions.